I'd been putting it off, but it was finally time to clean out my garage. So on February 10th, 2012, I rolled my wheelchair out into the garage and began cleaning up the pile that had been accumulating over the many years of my life. As I kept moving junk, I noticed the Beetle Light footlocker that I hadn't seen for years. It was still collecting dust and spiderwebs over in the corner under the window. It was an old, dirty military storage box that all of us kids were issued to keep our stuff in. It had been so many years that I had almost forgotten I still had it. Back in the 1980s, I journaled everything that happened to me during this time, and stored the journals in this footlocker. It was my job to draw illustrations and write descriptions of my experiences, as well as what my teammates told me their experiences were, and put them down in these journals. I rolled my wheelchair over to the footlocker, unlocked it, and opened the top of it. A puff of dust flew up in the air as the lid of the chest fell back. I could clearly see the neatly stacked journals were still as I had left them over 30 years ago. When I looked inside, I had forgotten how many of these I had done. Back when I had written these journals, it was a very scary time for our country. There was a Cold War going on between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is now Russia. These journals were top secret and could not be shown to anyone outside the government at the time. But now that Russia was no longer an enemy, they had been declassified and I was free to share them with anyone. It's strange for me to think that so much of my life was wrapped up in this little green beetle, which was the firefly symbol representing Beetle Light. So these are the journals of my life and the lives of my friends during that time. This all started when I was a 12-year-old boy in a small eastern coastal town in the United States, with an old Indian name called Lightning Bow. This is the next journal in the series. Journal number 4 is different, however, because I didn't write this one. It was written by one of our Beetle Light agents. Her name is Jillian Raintree, and she was the granddaughter and daughter of a Catawba Indian chief in North Carolina in the early 1980s. Her father had been killed in an airplane crash that she was also in. The airplane crash is how she lost the use of her legs, including the amputation of one leg. My job was to journal and keep records of all Beetle Light missions and journal them. But journal number 4 was not an official mission. It was an account of what happened to Jillian after we got back here to Beetletown from our successful submarine rescue mission in Cuba. This is her journal of a tragic and amazing thing that happened to her after we got back and while we were waiting for our next mission. I will present this next journal to you. I helped with the illustrations, but this is Jillian Raintree's Beetle Light Journal number 4, The Legend of the Royal James. Beetle Light Journal number 4, The Legend of the Royal James, Chapter 1. This is me. My name is Jillian Raintree. I'm a descendant of a Catawba tribe of Native American Indians. They came from the state of North Carolina, which is down the coast from Lightning Bow, and is where Beetletown is located. If you read Chris Richards' journals number 1, 2, and 3, you know all about our little town of Lightning Bow and the Beetle Light complex we call Beetletown. I would recommend you read those journals before reading mine so you will know about Beetle Light. My grandfather was chief of the particular Catawba tribe that we are descended from. We came from an area down in the state of North Carolina. My father was to be chief after him. I say was because my father died in the same plane crash that took away the use of my legs. My father and I were on a fishing trip over the state of Montana when our plane went down. As my father's daughter, I am next in line to lead my tribe. When this happened in 1982, this was only ceremonial, but my grandfather expected me to keep some of our traditions alive when it was his turn to pass. Unfortunately, this happened sooner than I had expected, and to lose both my father and my grandfather in the same year was very painful for me. It is many years later as I write this, but I think I can tell the story now of the legend of the Royal James. I was 16 years old and was a secret agent of the Beetle Light Special Operations Organization. I was asked to train for the Cuban submarine rescue mission that you read about in journal number 3. Beetle Light asked me to do this because of my archery skills and because of my experience with outdoor sports, which I love. They needed the cover story of my disability, so I trained long and hard with the rest of my team for the mission to get the Russian scientist, Dr. Boris Steingart, out of captivity from a Soviet submarine in Cuba. I have read Chris Richards' journals, and that inspired me to write a journal of my own. This journal is about what happened to me after the submarine mission when I was back at Beetletown. We were resting up from our adventure in Cuba. This story is strangely tied up with a real pirate in history by the name of Stede Bonnet. They also called him the Gentleman Pirate, and you can look him up in history back in the 1700s. What I'm going to tell you is beyond the historical Gentleman Pirate you may have heard about, but you won't find in any history books. It is the legend of the Royal James. My tribe of the Catawba covered most of the state of what is now North Carolina, along with about 6 other different tribes of Native Americans in the area. I grew up near the Cape Fear River in what people call today pirate country. Back in the 1700s, pirates would use the inlet waterways, rivers, hidden lagoons, and sandbars to hide from the Royal Navy after they attacked and looted ships. The pirate ships were fast, and they had shallow drafts, which meant they didn't sit down in the water that deep. This would mean they could move up and down the shallow rivers and tributaries away from the ocean and the big Royal Navy ships, which were chasing them. The big Navy ships could not get back into these shallow waterways to catch the pirates, or they would get stuck on the sandbars that were everywhere. These side rivers and lagoons were also great places to get out of bad weather, when there were hurricanes which came about every year to the east coast of our country. Back then, this area of North Carolina was also Indian territory, so there was a lot of trading going on between the Native Americans and the English. Chapter 2. Fun at Beetletown. As I said earlier, we at Beetle Light had just rescued a Russian scientist from a submarine in Cuba, and our team was still celebrating our victory and relaxing in Beetletown. Beetletown was a huge, football-sized abandoned rock quarry pit. It was covered by a giant geodesic dome made up of glass to let the sun in. This was important because there was a forest with waterfalls, ferns, and all kinds of life under half of the dome. This forest was here to raise and protect a special kind of firefly we have here in the town of Lightning Bow. This forest was the cover story for the other half of what went on under the dome of Beetletown. It was a huge aircraft hangar where special operations were carried out for the government by special agents that no one would ever suspect. Kids like me that had disabilities, but who also had special talents, which special agents would need to be successful in undercover work. Again, if you have read Chris's journals 1, 2, and 3, you will see how we were used to do these missions. But no one would ever suspect us of being special agents. Now that our latest mission was over, we could rest and have a little fun in Beetletown. By the way, our organization is called Beetle Light, which was named after the fireflies we protect in this man-made forest. But Beetletown is what we all called this giant world under this dome of glass. Half of what was under the dome was forest, and half was aircraft hangar and secret agent training center, hidden behind a fake forest curtain that no one on the outside could see. We had a restaurant and a cafe called Dirty Zerts that made special desserts for us. One of our favorites was called Potted Dirt. It was chocolate pudding with ground-up Oreo cookies and gummy worms stuck down in what looked like dirt and served in a small flower pot. This restaurant had all kinds of fun things to eat and was one of our favorite places to hang out between training. Chapter 3. Jiggers. One of the really fun things I liked to do was to ride these 6-wheeled ATVs, or all-terrain vehicles called jiggers, through the forest areas of Beetletown. These were made back in the 1960s, and our military had some lying around. When we weren't training, Major Santos, who was our commander, would let us play around and drive them through the forest and lake areas through Beetletown. They were really fun. You didn't need to use your legs or feet, just one hand, and you could drive them over rough terrain and through water like a boat. We had a lake and streams that ran through Beetletown Forest. These jiggers were designed to go anywhere. Something else that was kind of fun was up in the treetops and attached to catwalks and zip lines. They were what we called glow houses. Glow houses were really tree houses that were far up in the canopy of the forest. The scientists used them to store their experimental equipment, including all the different kinds of glow sticks and experimental lights that attracted our special species of firefly. Regular lights were not allowed in the forest or glowworm caves, which I'll talk about in a minute. The scientists would fly through the treetops on special harnesses that weave through the forest to gather information about the little beetles to help protect them. The suspended catwalks and zip lines would allow the scientists, or us kids on our days off of training, to get from one glow house to the next. We could walk or use our wheel racers to jet across the suspended catwalks as well. The glow houses were a place where you went to find the size, color, and shape glow stick you wanted to use to attract the fireflies. These sticks, once activated by hitting them on something or bending them, would light them up and turn them a certain color. You could make them into bracelets or necklaces or whatever you wanted. Back in the 1980s, they were not as easy to find as they are today. They were specially engineered to attract the fireflies. It was always fun zip-lining to a glow house in the center of Beetletown and picking out your favorite color, then using the flying harnesses to fly through the treetops with the fireflies. I don't know how he did it, but Ted applied for one of the best jobs in Beetletown, and he got it. I worked with Ted on the Cuban rescue mission. Everybody really liked him, including me, but I have to admit I was a little jealous that he got to run the main treetop glow house. He was in charge of keeping all the glow sticks stocked for the scientists, or any of us kids that wanted to go flying with the fireflies up in the trees, or to the cave. Ted picked the colors and the kind of glow sticks everybody got, so we all kept on his good side to get the best colors. I liked the necklace and the bracelet glow sticks, and Ted knew my favorite colors were green and purple, so he saved them for me. Some of the trees were hundreds of feet tall under the Beetletown dome. We had zip lines where you could go through the trees in a straight line across the forest treetops, but some of the scientists studying and monitoring the health of the fireflies designed this track that looked like a snake ride in a theme park. It weaved its way around and through the trees, and the harness platform that hung below it allowed someone in a wheel racer or a chair to have the same feeling of flying as the scientists that laid down on the platform. It was very magical. It was always the most popular thing to do at Beetletown with us kids. Chapter 4. Glowworms. Glowworms are best seen in New Zealand's caves, but our scientists studying bioluminescence, or the stuff that makes some animals glow, brought in glowworms and were growing them in the caves that line the quarry pit walls under the Beetle Light dome. One of our caves had a river, or more like a big stream, winding its way through it. The scientists brought the glowworms in and started a colony hanging from the ceilings of the water cave. We could use kayaks or even our jiggers and drive through the caves, gliding on the water, to see the glowworms dangling down glowing silk-like strands to catch moths or other flying bugs. It was a very magic light show. I would sometimes take my kayak and just let the current take me through the cave on the stream, looking up at the glowworm strands as they made pictures like stars on the ceiling. It was so quiet in the caves. It was one of my favorite places to hang out. I was over in the training center near the aircraft hangar, part of the Beetle Light complex, one day. That's where the shooting range was. I was practicing with my crossbow and a friend of mine, who was also an archer, hoping to make the Paralympic team someday. He had been a Beetle Light agent about as long as I had. His name was Nick Stanton. Nick had already gone on one undercover mission for the government to help the Secret Service find some bad people making fake money, which is against the law in our country. He was waiting, like me, for our next mission, and was trying to stay sharp with his archery skills, so we liked to practice together. After the Cuban rescue mission that Chris, Justice, Ted, and I had successfully completed, I was ready for another assignment. Ted had gotten called in on a mission with Chris and Justice, and were already in Egypt on something. I was the only one from our old team waiting for a new mission. I was getting bored waiting. I think Nick was feeling the same way. Nick Stanton was a lot like Justice and me. He was kind of serious, but he liked to goof around every now and then. He had full use of his upper body, but had a disease called MS that affected both his legs and a few other things. He was working on his family's ranch one day, and because the MS kept him from moving fast enough, the farm tractor ran over both his legs, crushing them instantly, and he lost them. But like Justice, he had mastered some high-tech running legs and feet, and competed in running events at the Paralympics. We were hoping that between Beetle Light missions we could practice enough to make the upcoming 1988 Paralympic Games. Nick was a good shot some days. I was better on the range on other days. But it was always good competition between us. In order to be asked to join Beetle Light, you had to have a visible disability that a potential enemy could be fooled by. You also had to have a talent that could help with missions. Chris talked about the Trojan horse stealth philosophy that we all had to use in his journal number 2, if you want to read about it. Nick qualified on both accounts and was a good agent. Chapter 5. My Grandfather's Dying. Nick and I were on the shooting range one day, trying to do the old Robin Hood trick of splitting the other person's arrow, when I got the message from a Beetle Light agent running toward me. It said, "My grandfather, who was the chief of our tribe down in North Carolina, wanted me to come to the local hospital to see him immediately. The message said he was dying and that I must hurry to his side as soon as possible." Nick was with me and said, "If there's anything I can do, let me know." I thanked him and took off for Major Santos, who was my commander, to tell him of the situation and that I needed to go immediately to the hospital in North Carolina. The hospital was some way down the coast from our little town of Lightning Bow, where Beetletown was located. Major Santos arranged a Beetle Light helicopter to fly me down to North Carolina to the hospital where my grandfather was being taken care of. This was one of the benefits of being a Beetle Light agent, but right then I was too worried about my grandfather to enjoy the helicopter ride. I just wanted to get to him. When I rolled into what I thought was my grandfather's room, I found someone else in the first bed lying next to my grandfather that I had to get past. You know when you have an immediate uneasy feeling about someone? Well, that's what I felt about this man. He motioned me over to his bed that was next to my grandfather's and said, "He's been asking for you. Are you Jillian Raintree?" I told this greasy-haired man that I was. He told me that he was in the hospital because he was going to have an appendix operation, and had gotten to know my grandfather while waiting for his surgery. I thought to myself, I doubt that. My grandfather would not have liked this man. He introduced himself as Giles Anthony, and that he had the biggest antique shop in town. He said, "You're a very pretty girl. How long will you be in town?" I told him I would be here as long as my grandfather needed me, and that he would have to excuse me. I needed to see my grandfather. As I rolled past Giles and over to my grandfather, he wiggled his fingers in a sleazy, creepy way as if to say goodbye, and just said, of course, don't let me hold you up." Giles had a snake-like smile as I moved past him. As I got closer to my grandfather, I heard beeps and air pumps, and saw all kinds of tubes and wires that my grandfather was hooked up to. He had an oxygen mask on, and was breathing heavily. The nurse came over to me and said that he had been asking for me, and that there was not a lot of time left. I had an immediate sinking feeling in my gut. I went over to him and leaned down and kissed him on the cheek, and his eyes opened and he smiled. He reached up and pulled off his mask. I reached over and put it back on, and he insisted that it should be off so he could talk to me. He said, "I don't have much time. I need to tell you. You will be the next leader of our tribe, and you will need to know about something passed down from every leader 300 years before me. Since your father is no longer with us, it falls to you, my dear. It is the legend of the Royal James." I had heard a little about this legend, but like everyone in our tribe, we thought it was just that, a legend from the old time. My grandfather said, "It is not a legend, and this will fall to you now." I was confused, but listened as he told me everything. What I didn't know at first was that the greasy-haired antique dealer lying in the bed next to us was listening to every word as well. Chapter 6. The Gentleman Pirate. My grandfather started telling me about this gentleman pirate from the 1700s, which I had never heard before, but I listened intently. I did not know what this had to do with me becoming leader of our tribe, or why it was so important at this particular time to tell me. The following is the true story of the gentleman pirate Stede Bonnet that my grandfather told me about. It will give some background as to the adventure that I was about to get involved in. Stede Bonnet was a rich landowner on the island of Barbados in the Caribbean in 1717, and did not have to steal and be a pirate. Some say he did it to get away from his nagging wife. Whatever the reason, one day he bought a ship, which pirates never did, and named it the Revenge. Then he changed the name to the Royal James. He hired a crew, which pirates also never did, and set out to steal and pillage ships up and down the American coastline, and live the life of a pirate. At first Bonnet was a very bad pirate, and his men almost mutinied, because he was such a bad leader. One day, however, Bonnet's ship, the Royal James, met up with the famous pirate Blackbeard, who was a real pirate. He was ruthless and tough. Bonnet's men wanted to follow Blackbeard, and Bonnet joined Blackbeard. Together, Bonnet learned how to be a real pirate, as they took ships up and down the American coast, and stole treasure from these ships. In between battles, Bonnet would just sit in his cabin most of the time in his pajamas, reading his books in the library, which he had brought aboard his ship. He loved books, and his cabin was filled with them. He would occasionally walk up on deck, in his pajamas or fancy gentleman's clothes, with a book in hand. This is where he got the name the Gentleman Pirate. Blackbeard and Bonnet took many ships, and the English Navy started searching for them. One day Bonnet and Blackbeard went their separate ways, and Bonnet sailed his ship off the ocean and up the Cape Fear River in North Carolina for repairs. Word got back to the authorities that the pirates were hiding up the Cape Fear River. Colonel Rhett from the Royal Navy found Stede Bonnet's ship, the Royal James, on the river, and there was a battle that lasted for many hours. Many men were killed in the battle, but Bonnet and his first mate were captured along with what was left of Bonnet's crew. The Royal James ran aground during the battle and was stuck in the mud. There is a plaque there still today next to the Cape Fear River where the battle took place. This is a picture of it. Bonnet and his crew were taken back to South Carolina, where most of Bonnet's crew were hung at a place called White Point in Charlestown. Now it's called Charleston. Bonnet and his first mate, William Harriot, however, escaped dressed as women. Bonnet grabbed an Indian and an African slave to serve them, and stole a small boat. They got as far as a place called Sullivan's Island. 14 days later, Colonel Rhett captured Bonnet a second time. Bonnet's first mate was shot and killed in the capture. The authorities also found the Indian and African slave, who were wounded in the recapture. Bonnet was taken back to Charlestown and hung at White Point with his men on December 10, 1718. He was buried, as was the custom with pirates, at the low water mark. That is, when the tide goes out, you dig the grave down in the mud and bury the body so that when the tide comes back up, the pirate is buried down in the mud under the water. It was considered an insult back then. A stone monument marks the spot in a park in Charleston near where Stede Bonnet was hung, and can be seen today. This is a picture of it. Chapter 7. Eli and the Catawba Indians. My grandfather went on to tell me about the African slave Eli that our ancestors had saved back 300 years ago. Giles Anthony was also getting an earful as he eavesdropped through the thin curtain separating his bed from my grandfather's. I was now aware of it, but there was nothing I could do about it. My grandfather went on with his story. My grandfather continued with his story. At the time of the arrest, the authorities were so busy with Stede Bonnet they couldn't be bothered with a Catawba Indian and a slave. So the Indian made his way back to his village, our ancestors' village, he said pointedly, and he brought the African slave whose name was Eli with him. The tribe nursed both men back to health, and Eli was very grateful to the tribe, because as a slave no one had ever cared for him before. At about this time there was a great hurricane. Stede Bonnet's pirate ship, the Royal James, was still stuck in the mud on the Cape Fear River after the battle. The hurricane blew the great ship off the sandbar and far up the river into the back country. The wind and rain were so great that the ship was pushed up and over the banks of the river, deep into the muddy, alligator-infested swamp. This swamp was not too far from the Catawba Tribe's location. It was about a day's walk. The ship sank down into the muck and mud of the swamp, up to the handrails on the top deck of the ship. The storm continued to pile up mud and forest debris on top of the ship, completely hiding it and making it an island in the middle of a muddy swamp pond. After Eli healed from his wounds from Bonnet's recapture, he knew he had to leave the tribe, because someone sooner or later would find him there and take him back to Charlestown as a slave. One day he went to the chief of the tribe that had saved his life and asked permission to leave before the authorities found him there. The chief understood and gave him food and provisions for his journey. Eli thanked the chief for all that he had done for him, and Eli started out into the swampy forest to try to find some place to hide. My grandfather looked me straight in the eye and said, "This chief was my great-great-grandfather." He continued on. Eli left the village and went down to the river, where he saw huge scratch marks on the riverbank, where he saw something very large that had been dragged up and over the riverbank and down into the swamp beyond. Eli decided to investigate and follow the deep gashes in the earth for a way through the swamp. He could see there were alligators out in the water, but not near where he was. He looked across the water of the swamp to see an island in the middle, made of mud, brush, and fallen trees from the storm. Eli noticed that something very strange was sticking up out of the pile of debris and mud in the middle of this island. It was the front wooden pole of a great ship sticking out. Eli swam over to it and climbed up on the newly created mud island to find that a giant ship was under all the storm debris, buried down deep in the pile of it all. Eli started digging by hand on top of the mud island. He moved brush, tree limbs, and mud all day, until he could see a wooden doorway. He moved the last bit of mud around the doorway and slid the door open. Eli entered the top of the stairs, which took him down deep inside the ship, where everything was left just how it had been after the battle and arrest of the pirate Stede Bonnet. There was still a little blood spattered up on the walls inside the ship, where the soldiers and the pirates had crossed swords, but the inside of the ship was still sound and in good shape. It was under tons of mud that was pushing on the outside walls of the ship. He walked through the huge cannon deck room and straight to the captain's cabin at the rear of the ship, and opened the door to see more books than he had ever seen before. It was the Royal James, and this was to be Eli's new home for the next 40 years. For him, it was the perfect place to hide. It was in the middle of the swamp, hidden by trees and brush, and it was also protected by alligators on all sides. No one would ever come into this swamp looking for a runaway slave. My grandfather then said, "Daughter, reach into my bag over there and pull out the map." I did as he asked and pulled out a very old piece of leather with some burned markings on it. It had a picture of the Cape Fear River and the location of our original village from around 300 years ago. The village was now long gone and part of a shopping mall. On the map, there was a line leading from the ancient village to the Cape Fear River and over a bank down into a swamp that is still there today. It is a day's walk from the village to this location. Grandfather said while pointing at the map, "The swamp is on the other side of this riverbank." I stopped my grandfather as he was describing this swamp, because my father had already taken me to it when we were on our way to a fishing trip. I explained to my grandfather and said, "Grandfather, I know this place. My father took me here when I was younger. We were going on a fishing trip, and he said there was something that I must see, as someday I would be the leader of our tribe. I didn't understand. We were to go fishing, but when we came to this swamp, there were alligators everywhere, and my father would not even let us get close to the water's edge. He said it was too dangerous, but that it was important that I remember this place. I still remember where it is, but I didn't know why a swamp filled with alligators was so important." Grandfather continued, "Your father wanted to show you something passed down to all the leaders of our tribe for 300 years. Still holding the map and pointing to what looked like an island in the middle of a pond, he said, 'Do you remember the island in the middle of the swamp pond?' I said that my father had pointed it out to me when we were there. He continued, 'In the middle of the swamp is a mud island with trees growing on it still today. Inside the trees and brush, part of the front of the ship still sticks up out of the mud island, hidden by those trees.' He looked up at me and said, 'The Royal James is here.' He pointed to the island on the map. This was a very cool historical thing, but I was still too worried about my grandfather at this point to care much about some island in a swamp. He continued, 'The swamp is an alligator rookery, which means there are baby alligators everywhere, with adult gators fiercely guarding their young, just about the most dangerous place to be in a swamp. You must be in a boat with high sides to safely get to the island. Along with the mother alligators guarding their young, there is what many of our people call the man-eater. He is a 14 or 15-foot long male bull gator that guards his females and this swamp pond. It is said that over the years he has taken many people and animals that have ventured too close to the edge of this swamp pond. Beware of him.' I kept wondering why he was telling me all this. My grandfather then started coughing and looked to be getting weaker. I picked up the oxygen mask to give him some air and said, 'All this can wait.' He brushed it away and continued between coughing to say, 'I need to tell you there's more.' He put the map down on the bedstand between him and Giles. I was frustrated with him because he was using all the strength he had left in telling me this stupid pirate story. I just didn't understand. Chapter 8. The Gift of the Flintlock. My grandfather went on to say, Eli lived deep in the swamp, in this old ship of war, that was buried from view in the deep forest. The pond over the years became even more alligator infested, and no one would come looking for a runaway slave living this deep in the swamp. It was perfect for Eli. One day, inside the captain's cabin, Eli was in the library that Stede Bonnet had brought on board. Eli could not read, but liked to look at the illustrations in some of the books. He opened the largest book in the library and found a flintlock pistol hidden inside it. It had a silver coin embedded on one side of the handle and a gold coin on the other. He kept it because he knew it was valuable, and if he was caught some day, he might be able to buy his freedom with the pistol that only grew in value every year because it belonged to a famous pirate. Once the tribe had brought Eli back to health after the pirate Bonnet's arrest, they felt responsible for him and would occasionally bring him food and provisions out in the swamp, where he was living in the buried Royal James. One day Eli was out hunting for food, and he was bitten by a water moccasin snake, which, as you know, are very poisonous. By the time the tribe had found him, he was almost dead. As he was dying, my great-great-grandfather and 2 men from the village were there on the island with him, and Eli asked to be taken into the library cabin inside the ship. So they picked him up and carried him into the ship. When they got him into the library of the ship, they laid him down on the bed in the cabin. Eli pointed up to one of the bookshelves and at the biggest book on the shelf. The Indian chief pulled the book off the shelf, and Eli motioned for him to open it. The book was hollowed out to make room for the flintlock pistol that had the Spanish gold and silver coins embedded in it, that he had found many years earlier. Eli looked up at the chief and said, "Thank you for saving me all those years ago. I leave all of this to you, the ship and this pistol, with the coins embedded in it." This was now 1758, 40 years after the gentleman pirate Stede Bonnet had been hung. Stede Bonnet had become a folk hero. Anything that he might have owned was worth a lot of money, and that included the flintlock pistol with the coins still embedded in it. Eli said that the pistol had great value now to the white man, and if your village ever needed money, you would have this pistol to trade with. Eli said, "It is yours to do with as you will. I would ask just one more thing. Please leave me in this room. I don't want the wolves to get me on the outside." The chief honored Eli's request and agreed to leave him in the ship. Then Eli died right there in Stede Bonnet's bed, in the library of the captain's cabin. The chief pulled the blanket up and carefully laid it over his friend, lying there in the bed. The chief put the pistol back in the book and placed it up on the shelf. He then turned and looked at his two men, which had helped bring Eli into the ship and to the captain's cabin. He then said to them, "You will never speak of this to anyone." The two Indians nodded that they understood, and they never mentioned the ship's location, the pistol, or that Eli had died inside the Royal James to anyone. The chief did not have the same view of the value the pistol had that Eli did. His view was that the pirate probably used the pistol to steal and kill in the name of money from other people, so it might be cursed. So he just let it sit in the book and kept it on the shelf inside the ship for all the years he led our tribe. He remembered that Eli said it might be good for trading. He thought that if the tribe was ever in trouble and needed something important, he would keep it for the sake of the tribe, and he kept it in the back of his mind. But to the chief, the ship was a burial ground, and the chief left the pistol and the Royal James alone. When this chief was very old and dying, like I am now, he told his son just before he died about the location and the story of the pistol. His son would soon be the next chief, and he would pass on the location and the story of Stede Bonnet's lost ship, Eli and the flintlock, down through the generations of chiefs, like I am doing with you today. As leader of our tribe, I leave the care of the Royal James and everything in it to your keeping. It belongs to our people. Do with it as your heart tells you. It is my wish that this history be shared and seen by many people, but that no money is to be made from it. If you can do that, then I will be pleased." Then my grandfather started coughing again, louder and harder. I lifted the oxygen mask back up on his face. Then I rushed out to get a nurse, passing Giles, who was just lying in bed with a strange smile as I passed. When I got back into my grandfather's room with the nurse, I heard a loud, single, steady beep from the heart monitor machine, which meant my grandfather had died. The nurse reached over to my hand and said, "I'm sorry, honey. He has passed. We will gather all his things for you later, and we will take care of everything from here." I went back to his bedside to give him one last hug and kiss goodbye. When I said my last goodbye, the nurse came over to me and rolled me out of the room and into the hallway. She said she would be preparing him for transport because people from my tribe had been notified and would be coming to pick my grandfather up for proper burial. 2 hospital men came into the room to help the nurse move my grandfather to a gurney for transport out of the room. I just waited in the hallway, still in shock. A few minutes later, men and the nurse rolled my grandfather out into the room past me, as I was just sitting in the hallway. I continued staring at the wall, thinking I would never see him again in this life. I was stunned and felt very alone. After my father died in the plane crash that put me in this wheelchair, my grandfather was all I had tying me to my tribe. My mother, who I love, is white and tries to understand about my Indian heritage. But it's not the same as my grandfather telling me stories of our people from the old days. Now that I was a member of Beetle Light, they had become my family. Our mission to rescue Dr. Steingart from the Soviet submarine navy in 1984, a year earlier, had forged a strong bond between me and the team. I guess looking back is natural to reflect on people important in your life when you lose someone special. I was especially close to Major Santos, my commander back at Beetletown, and he was now the closest thing to a father I had. Chapter 9. Giles Starts Plotting. I must have sat there in the hallway for 20 minutes, just thinking, and then I heard the strangest thing coming from inside my grandfather's hospital room. It was coming from Giles, that creepy antique dealer guy, in the bed next to where my grandfather was. Something very sad had just happened in that room, and yet this man was on the phone talking to someone and laughing with excitement. I heard my grandfather's name mentioned, so I rolled my racer closer to the doorway, but was staying out of sight in the hallway. I could easily hear everything he was saying because he was so loud and obnoxious with whoever he was giving orders to on the phone. I could hear Giles telling someone that clearly worked for him on the phone that he had just heard of where a real pirate ship was, with something of great value in it. He said that he had seen a map and knows exactly where this hidden pirate ship was. Giles told whoever he was talking to that after his operation and recovery in 2 days, that they would go out and find the Royal James and take the contents of the ship for themselves. He told this man over the phone to get ready and find a boat with tall sides to it, because he also heard my grandfather's warning about the man-eater, and he was a little scared about that. Then I heard Giles say something that I didn't understand at the time, but would in the future. He said, "I have proof now that I have the right to the gentleman pirate Bonnet's ship and the flintlock pistol. I didn't know how that could be true. I was wondering, how could he legally take possession of a ship and the contents that had been passed down to our tribe all these years? What proof could he have? All I knew was I had just lost my grandfather, and I would honor his last request of letting everyone see this piece of history and not making any money from it. I didn't know how, but I would try, and I had 2 days before Giles would be ready to pillage the Royal James. Then I thought, maybe Giles was related to the pirate, because that's what they used to do, take things that didn't belong to them. But that wasn't it. He must have something else for proof of ownership." After the ceremony of my grandfather's funeral, I needed to get out and find the ship. But I was going to need help, so I went to Nick Stanton and told him the story. He told me I would have to go to our commander, Major Santos, and ask for permission, and I didn't know how this would go over with him. This was not a government project, and he had already done a personal favor for me by using the Beetle Light helicopter to fly me down to the hospital in North Carolina. Then one of our agents came to me with my grandfather's things in a box, left at the front gate from the hospital. He said, "This was left for you at the security gate." I thanked him and opened the box. All my grandfather's personal things from the hospital were in the box. I suddenly got depressed again, looking at everything. I then noticed the map was not in the box, with my grandfather's other things. The only thing that came to mind was Giles. I thought, he must have the map. This was going to be more of a problem than I originally thought. But for now, I needed to get to the ship, if I could find it, and get the flintlock pistol before Giles got out of the hospital. Then I got an idea that would satisfy both my grandfather's wish that the pistol be shared with many people, and would motivate Major Santos to help me with Beetle Light resources, like one of the helicopters and maybe one of our jiggers. If we could find the Royal James before Giles did, and get the pistol out of the library in the ship's cabin, we could donate it to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. This would make it a government mission, and Major Santos might say yes. So I hurried off to find him to ask. I found Major Santos in the weight room working out, and came up to him and said, "First, I wanted to thank you for flying me to the hospital before my grandfather died." Major Santos looked at me and said, "It is the least we can do for the service you have been to your country, Jillian." I went on to say, "There's something else I have to tell you, and I'm going to ask for another favor." He sat back and just said, "What's up?" I told him the whole story about the Royal James and the little time we had because Giles was going to try to steal the flintlock pistol before we could get there. I also told him my grandfather's wish that many people would be able to see this part of American history, but that we could not make any money from the cursed weapon. So I suggested the best place for millions of people to see it would be the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, which displays our nation's most important artifacts. Major Santos sat there for a moment thinking and said, "I think that Washington would support an operation like this, to recover this piece of history for the Smithsonian Museum. Let me call them." I added, "Sir, we don't have much time. Giles is planning on going to raid the ship tomorrow after his operation and is released from the hospital." Major Santos said, "The only thing I see that might get in the way is that if the undercover status of Beetle Light is found out in any way. I will call Washington right now and see what they say." He left the room, and I waited to see what his commander in Washington would say. I was really afraid they would say no, and was nervous, so I went to the places I normally would go when I needed to relax. First I went over to the Dirty Zerts Cafe and got some potted dirt to eat. Dirty Zerts was a little dessert cafe that only made fun desserts and candies for the kids that worked here at Beetletown. Potted dirt was one of my favorites, and I thought it might cheer me up a little. It was made from chocolate pudding and ground-up Oreo cookies, with gummy worms stuffed down in fake dirt, and served inside a plastic flower pot. It was really good. Dirty Zerts made all kinds of fun desserts. After I finished my potted dirt pudding, I rolled down to the stream, which flows through Beetletown under the dome, and got into my kayak. I paddled into the huge glowworm caves in the walls of the Beetle Light complex, which had at one time been a giant rock quarry pit. The forest had grown up underneath the dome and covered many of them, but some of the caves were still being used to raise and study the bioluminescence of glowworms. That's the light they produce like fireflies. In fact, they're beetles too, and are related to fireflies. Inside the cave, I just floated in my kayak under the natural lights from the glowworms hanging from the ceiling. It was completely quiet and dark, except for the blue lights dangling from the ceiling. There wasn't a more peaceful or private place to be and think. This was the first time I really had a chance to be alone and think about my grandfather. Tears started coming down my face, and I found myself doing something that I never do. I was crying there in the dark cave, thinking that I'll never see my grandfather again. And now that my own father was gone from the plane crash that took the use of my legs, I really felt alone. These people I work with here, like Nick and Chris and Major Santos, were all the family I had left. I'm a strong person, and I don't like to show weakness. This is probably something I got being the only daughter of my father, who was a very kind but proud man, and never showed emotion to anyone. Chapter 10. Major Santos says, "The mission is a go." I heard something from outside the cave, under the dome. Tears were still coming down my face, and I tried to act normal and wipe them away as fast as I could. It was Nick, and he said Major Santos was looking for me. I wiped the tears completely away and paddled my kayak to the bank and got into my wheel racer. I went directly to Major Santos's office to find out if we could go get the pistol or not. I rolled into Major Santos's office and asked, "Can we do it?" He looked at me and said, "They said yes, as long as no one finds out you are part of Beetle Light or anything at all about what we do here." I rolled over and hugged him and said, "Thank you. This would mean a lot to my grandfather." I looked up at Major Santos, and he had a serious look on his face. He was holding a satellite photo of something swirling on a black background. Major Santos said, "We have a slight problem. Gloria." I said, "Gloria? What's Gloria?" He said, "Tomorrow, September 16th, Gloria is going to hit the North Carolina coast with a punch. The winds will be up to 105 miles per hour in places. The winds have already picked up. This is a major hurricane, one of the biggest we have seen in this area in a long time." This was in 1985, and Gloria was going to hit right in the middle of pirate country, and the swamp where the Royal James was hidden. Major Santos warned that it may destroy what was left of the ship with the wind, rain, and flooding that was coming. Our helicopters can't fly in hurricane winds. It was already late in the day and looking stormy outside. The hurricane was coming. It would take all night to get ready, so we needed to get started right now. I looked at him and said, "If we're thinking that the ship might be destroyed, then you know Giles is thinking the same thing, and will go and try to steal that pistol before something happens to the ship, maybe even today. We need to get ready now, and see if we can get there first." Major Santos asked, "So, what is your plan?" I answered, "I think we take Chopper 1 and attach one of our jiggers under it to get as close to the swamp as we can before the winds stop the helicopter. Nick and I will take the jigger through the swamp the rest of the way until we can get to the pond. I shoot a zip line over to the island. Nick zips over to it and goes down into the ship if he can, finds the library and the right book, gets the pistol, and gets back to the jigger. We get out of there with the jigger onto the main road, where you have the van waiting to load us and the jigger. The Smithsonian has a piece of history that millions of people will be able to see forever. What do you think?" Major Santos was speechless that I had thought it out so carefully. I added, Nick and I were bored anyway. We don't have any missions lined up, so what do you say? Can we go? If Major Santos knew what was ahead of us, there's no way he would have let us go. But since he didn't, he said, "Okay, let's go visit a pirate ship, if it's still there. You know you're talking about a ship that has been buried in the mud for about 300 years, right? The thing has got to be rotted and brittle by now. It may be dangerous to go down inside it." This didn't deter us a bit. It sounded cool to find a historical pirate ship, and honor my ancestors in the process. So we got to work and put together all the gear we might need. Nick went out and got one of our jiggers and filled it up with gas. These jiggers were made back in the 1960s, I think, and could go anywhere. They could go over rough terrain. They could also drive out on water or mud like a boat. The military bought a few of them from the jigger company that made them, but the company went out of business many years ago. They work great in the forest areas of Beetletown, but would be perfect out in the swamps of North Carolina. We attached the jigger to a cable under one of our helicopters and opened the side hangar doors of the giant glass dome of Beetletown. Then we rolled out the helicopter into the coming storm. We all got in the chopper and took off from Lightning Bow. We had our little yellow jigger hanging under the helicopter as we flew down to the Cape Fear River of North Carolina. The skies were getting darker, and the pilot looked back at Major Santos and said, "We're getting some pretty strong headwinds out there." We passed the outer banks of Cape Hatteras, which was north of where the Cape Fear River started. This was the same place that the pirate Stede Bonnet took his ship before the battle with the Royal Navy back in the 1700s. This was all getting to be really exciting. Even Major Santos thought it was cool. He was getting a little concerned about the weather ahead, however, and said to the pilot, "How far to the drop-off point?" The pilot said, "Major, I don't know if we're going to make the drop-off point before the hurricane hits land ahead of us. We're 5 miles out. I think I'll go another 4 miles, and I'll have to put your agents down. They'll have to go the final mile on the ground in the jigger." He was right. We were getting tossed around pretty good in the helicopter, and Major Santos was responsible for us and the $3 million helicopter we were flying in. He came over to us and said, "We're going to have to turn around. It's getting too rough out there. The winds are increasing and are unsafe." I looked at him and said, "Okay, get us as close as you can, and we'll take the jigger in the rest of the way through the swamp." He looked at me and said, "I wasn't counting on this hurricane, Jillian. It's getting bad." I looked at him and said, "Compared to what we went through on the Cuban submarine rescue, this is a walk in the park. Come on, sir, drop us off. We'll grab the pistol before Giles gets it and meet you back at the van on the main road behind the swamp." Major Santos was hesitating, as he was thinking about it, but he owed me for making his submarine rescue a success. I looked at him again and said, "Please, sir, it was my grandfather's dying wish. I can't let him down." With Major Santos being a Navy SEAL, I knew I could finish him off and convince him to let us go, so I said, "Sir, it's a matter of honor. I gave my word to my grandfather." That did the trick. Duty and honor is what the U.S. Navy SEALs live by. He told the pilot to land and unhook the jigger that was hanging under the helicopter. Nick and I got out of the chopper. Nick had his high-tech legs on and carried me over to the controls of the jigger. The hurricane winds outside were getting stronger and blowing harder than the helicopter blades that were swirling over our heads. Nick got in the passenger side of the jigger, and we drove over to the door of the helicopter. Major Santos yelled from inside the helicopter, "You two sure you're up to this?" Nick gave him the thumbs up and said, "If it gets too bad, we'll wait the storm out inside the ship underground." The Major added, "Call me when you're ready to be picked up, and I'll bring the van for you and the jigger. Bring us back some history. Good hunting," he said. The pilot leaned back to Major Santos and said, "Sir, we have to get out of here now. The winds are getting too strong." With that, they took off up and into the black, stormy sky to get the helicopter back safely in the hangar inside Beetletown before the strength of the hurricane hit. Nick and I looked at each other and all of a sudden felt alone sitting in the middle of this swampy forest. It hadn't started to rain fully yet, but the winds were getting stronger. Nick pulled out his compass, and that showed which direction to go, so we started that way in the jigger. The jigger is essentially a six-wheeled mini boat that can go almost anywhere. We used to take it over some pretty rough stuff back in the forest inside Beetletown, but this was a whole different story out here in this stormy swamp. Trees were falling over, and we were driving up and over huge tree trunks and down into gullies that were running with ever-increasing amounts of water. The jigger was having no problem going over and through all this stuff, though. It started raining harder, and snakes and other critters were coming out of their holes. As we were crossing a deep river, a water moccasin swam up on the front of our jigger. This was the same kind of snake that had killed Eli 300 years ago. If we got bit, we had anti-venom today that could save our lives that Eli didn't have back then. But by the time we got to a hospital, it might be too late for us, too. I opened the secret door in my artificial leg and grabbed the police baton I was carrying and handed it to Nick to hit the snake off the front of the jigger as I drove. The snake wasn't trying to get us, it was just trying to get out of the raging river. Either way, I wanted it away from us. Nick took a swing at the snake and hit him like he was a baseball, and he went flying downstream from us. He kept swimming downriver until he found a log to get up on. Chapter 11. Arriving at the swamp pond. We finally arrived at the Cape Fear River and drove up and over the bank of it. Because of the hurricane, the water level from the river was rising up the bank and almost to the top, where it would start flooding the swamp on the other side. As we crested the top of the bank, with the rising river on one side and the swamp pond on the other, we could see an island out in the middle of the pond, with trees and shrubs growing on it. This was the location the map pointed to that Giles had stolen. I remember coming here a few years ago with my father. Brush and trees had grown up on the tiny island in the middle of the pond, and were too thick to see anything, much less the front of a ship sticking out. The hurricane had finally arrived, and the winds were really pushing against the jigger. The rain was coming down hard, and the river was almost to the top of the bank. In places it had already gone over, and was filling the swampy pond that had the island in the middle of it with mud and slimy water from the river. I thought I would drive the jigger down the other side of the river bank and into the swamp, and drive across. Then I saw them. My grandfather's description of this swamp was completely correct. If anything, he understated how many gators were here. It was a perfect place for a rookery. Mother gators could protect and raise their little ones until they were big enough to go up and over the riverbank and down into the river to hunt. There were gators everywhere, and the noise from the jigger's engine, along with the storm, had stirred them all up. The jigger rides very low in the water, and that's why the water moccasin snake had no problem swimming up on the front of the jigger. These gators wouldn't have any problem coming right into the jigger with us and grabbing us out. I immediately put the jigger in reverse and backed up the bank to the top of it. I looked at Nick and said, "We're not going across the water to the island in this." Nick just looked at me and nodded in agreement. I drove around the pond and off the riverbank into the woods surrounding the pond. I was trying to find a clear shot at one of the bigger trees on the island, which we could shoot at to string a zip line to. The wind was not as bad over here on the forest side of the pond as it was on the riverbank side. We finally located a big tree with a thick limb to shoot at. I opened the compartment in my leg that has hidden things in it that I've used in missions before, and pulled out my crossbow and snapped it into position. Then I pulled out a bolt, which is a small arrow for crossbows, and attached a thick string to it. I took aim just above the big limb on the tree, and shot my crossbow. The bolt flew past the big limb perfectly, then draped down on its other side. That was the easy part. Now Nick opened one of his legs and pulled out a small radio-controlled helicopter, and in the other leg he pulled out a radio controller for it. He fired up the tiny helicopter, and the blade started turning at high speed. He gave me the helicopter to hold while he got a hook to attach to the bottom of it, and the radio controller for it situated so he could drive it. Then he told me to let go, and the helicopter with the hook hanging under it started flying over the swamp and the gators' heads to the limb on the tree on the island that had our string that was draped on it. The wind was a real problem, and the tiny helicopter was having a hard time flying against the wind, but it was moving slowly toward the island. The alligators were right under the helicopter as it flew over to the island. If the helicopter went down, I'm sure they would have munched it. The helicopter finally got over to the tree limb, and Nick directed it to the string. He was trying to get the hook to grab the string, which was draped over the limb, and fly the end of it back to us in the jigger. The jigger was parked higher than the island, and if he could get the end of the string back, we could pull a thicker cable attached to the string around the limb and attach it to the heavy jigger. Nick finally grabbed the end of the string attached to the bolt and flew it back over the gators and up the bank to us in the forest. We attached a thicker metal cable to the string and pulled it around the limb and back to us. Now we had our zip line. Nick got out of the jigger and attached one end of the line to a tree and the other to a metal bar in the jigger. Then I drove the jigger backwards, which tightened the line. If the line was not tight, Nick would lag in the middle of the zip line as he zipped down the line to the island and into the pond with the gators. The zip line had to be very tight so he could fly above them to the island safely. We were now ready for Nick to zip line to the island, but we still had one more thing to do. The island was covered with brush, trees, and one more thing: gators. Nick pulled out his high-powered bow and attached what police call a flashbang grenade to the tip of the arrow. Only police and special government agents are allowed to use these. They are grenades that make a powerful blast and an incredible flash of light, but do not kill. They are used by police to go into a house or dangerous place to stun the bad guys before they go in. Nick was going to use this flashbang to scare off any gators that might be on the island before he got there. He pulled the bow back, took aim, and had me pull the grenade pin, which would make it explode in 3 or 4 seconds. I pulled the pin, and he shot the arrow at the island. The arrow landed and stuck in the ground on the island. It took a few seconds, then it went off and blew up. Every alligator that was on the island and in the brush all flew off the island, swimming in every direction. It did the job, and the tiny island was free of gators. We didn't know how long they would stay away, so Nick hooked up the zip line and got up on the jigger ready to jump and fly down the zip line to the island. There were still gators in the water under the zip line, so just before Nick jumped, I reversed the jigger a little more to really make the zip line tight, so Nick would sail high above the gators and above the water to land safely on the island. I gave him a machete, which is a long knife that looks like a sword, to cut away the brush on the island, and he put it in his belt. He clicked his hook and harness to the zip line and jumped from the jigger and flew across the pond and over the gators below. He kind of looked funny, like he was a pirate with a long knife in his belt, but I didn't let him see me laughing at him as he flew across the water. He landed on the island and pulled out his machete in case there were any other gators still left on the island. Then he started clearing brush and small trees. He made his way through the brush on the island and pulled back the vines to reveal a most amazing sight. There, sticking up out of the mud, was a piece of rotten wood that looked like a broken telephone pole. As he pulled more and more vines off, he could see an ancient path in the dirt leading down to an old rotten wooden deck of a ship. Following the wooden deck, Nick came to a doorway that no longer had the whole door covering the entrance. Much of the door had rotted away and was worn down by weather and possibly animals using the inside of the ship as a den. This changed everything. We all thought we would find a sealed, intact ship, free from the outside elements. But over time, nature had made its way into the ship. Nick pulled out a small radio that he could talk to me with and said, "It's not what we thought. The ship is open, and it looks like animals have been using it to live in." I said, "Is it safe to go down inside?" Nick said, "I don't know. There could still be a gator or two down in there. I'm going down inside to see. I'll keep you updated." I was frustrated because I wanted to see what was inside too, but someone had to stay with the jigger and keep tension on the zip line for Nick to escape if he found the flintlock pistol. Chapter 12. Going into the ship. Nick pulled out a flashlight and had it in one hand, the machete he had in the other, as he made his way down the stairs to the main level cannon room. It led to the captain's cabin at the back of the ship. Spider webs covered his path, and he had to tear the webs from in front of him to get by. All of a sudden, he heard a very low and soft rumble. It kind of sounded like a lion growling, but much lower and slower. Nick got on the radio to me and said, "Hey, Jillian, I think there's something down in here with me, and it sounds really big." I came back on the radio and asked, "How close to the captain's cabin are you?" Nick came back and said, "The door's a little ways in front of me, but there's something definitely behind me in the dark. I hear a low rumbling sound." Now, I've spent a lot of time with my father out in the swamp fishing, and I knew exactly what that sound was, but I didn't want to panic Nick, so I was as calm as I could be on the radio and said, "Nick, listen very carefully to me. That sound you are hearing behind you is a male bull alligator. He's warning you that you're in his territory. Move slowly to the captain's cabin door. Get inside as soon as you can and close the door. Do you understand?" Nick came back a little shaky on the radio and whispered, "Yes, I get it. I'm opening the door now." Nick opened the door slowly, then stepped in quickly and slammed the door behind him shut. I heard over the radio, "I'm in the cabin with the door shut, but I can still hear the rumbling sound on the other side of the door, and it's getting louder." I told him, "Okay, let's use this time to find the pistol, then we'll worry about the gator later." Just as I said that, the hurricane got much stronger, and water and lots of mud came gushing over the banks of the river and down the other side into the pond, filling it up. It was coming up fast and was rising up the sides of the island and heading for the doorway to the ship Nick was in. I got back on the radio to Nick and said, "Hey, buddy, you have another problem coming your way. The mud and the water have crested the top of the river bank and is now filling this pond. The mud and swamp level will be coming up into the ship soon. I can see the water level climbing up the bank of the island and close to the ship's doorway. You need to hurry." Nick came back on the radio a little rattled and said, "Great. That's just great. I'm in the cabin and it's very dark. I can't see much of anything. I'm going to light a flare." I said, "Okay, but hurry. The ship's going to start filling with mud and water any minute." Nick reached into his leg compartment and pulled out a flare and lit it. It lit the entire cabin he was standing in. He said it was amazing, like going back in time. There was a table in the middle of the room with old navigation maps and equipment on it. On every wall, books, tons of books, filled special shelves that held the books in place so as the ship rocked back and forth, they would not fall off the shelves. Over in a dark corner was a large four-post bed, with little carved wooden pineapples on each post of the bed. There was something covered in the bed, under a blanket. Nick radioed back to me. "I found the library, Jillian. I found the captain's bed." Then there was a long pause, and Nick continued, "There is someone in the bed under a blanket." I tried to calm him down and said, "Nick, that is Eli. Leave him in peace." I heard back immediately, "I will definitely leave him in peace. I'm not going to touch that bed." I could see that mud had finally gone down the path that Nick had cleared to get to the ship and the doorway. It was running into the ship. I yelled on the radio to Nick, "Nick, you have to get out of there. Mud is pouring into the ship right now. Grab the pistol and get out of there." As soon as Nick heard my warning, he said, "Okay, but which one of these books has the pistol?" I came back and said, "My grandfather said it was the biggest one on the shelf." Nick replied, "They're all big." Nick looked up at all the books, and as he did, the ship shifted with all the extra weight of the mud pouring into the doorway, and went over on its side. Books were falling all around Nick, and then something really gross happened. I could see that the island was moving from where I was standing, even through the wind and rain of the storm, and I got on the radio. I was screaming at Nick to answer. "Nick, Nick, are you okay? I just saw the ship roll over. Are you okay?" I pictured the ship finally being crushed by all the extra mud pouring into the swamp around the ship's hull. Nick had been knocked off his feet, and the flare fell out of his hand and rolled over to the bed, which was now on its side. Nick reached over to grab the torch, and Eli had fallen on top of him and out from under his blanket. He was now a skeleton, and Nick was looking face to face with Eli's skull. The rest of Eli's tattered clothes and bones draped over Nick, and it was too gross to explain. Nick screamed and kicked Eli off from him. He could hear me yelling his name over and over again on the radio, which had fallen out of his hand when the ship rolled over. Water was now coming from under the door, and the ship was filling with mud. This was a nightmare. Nick was in the worst possible situation. He grabbed the radio and said, "Jillian, I'm okay. I just had a close encounter with Eli that I'll tell you about later. The mud and the water are coming from under the door. I think the ship is filling with mud. I can hear the walls of the ship are cracking too. I think the ship is being crushed by the weight of all this extra mud and water." I came back on the radio and said, "I know, I've been trying to tell you that the storm is getting worse out here and the swamp is filling up. You need to get out of there now." Nick came back and said, "Okay, I'm getting out of here. I can't find the pistol in all these books anyway. They're everywhere. I'm coming out. Sorry I couldn't find the flintlock." I said, "Don't worry about it. It's not worth your life. Get out of there." Nick tried to open the door of the cabin, but because of the weight of the mud, which was leaning up against the other side of the door, it was extremely hard to turn the handle and open it. He finally used both hands and turned the handle as hard as he could. It turned, and the door burst open to flood the cabin with mud, water, and pond slime. As the water came into the room, it changed the balance of the ship again, and the entire ship rolled back over upright, and the bed fell back down as it had been. Many of the books were now floating, and the water put out the flare. The room went black again, and Nick was scrambling in the dark to get up on top of the bed, which was high enough to be out of the rising mud that was filling the cabin. Nick heard something in the totally dark room that was with him now. It was that same growling, rumbling sound that he had heard earlier. He popped open his leg and grabbed another flare and lit it. When the room lit up, he had an unwanted guest in there with him. It was the biggest alligator he had ever seen, and he was down on the floor below the bed with his mouth wide open, facing Nick. Nick had the flare in his hand, and the brightness of the fire coming from the end of it was the only thing between him and this man-eater having Nick for lunch. He got on the radio to me and said softly in a whisper, "Jillian, I have company in here with me, right now. It's the biggest gator I've ever seen." I could hear the gator's rumbling growls over the radio and said, "Nick, that's the man-eater. He's made the inside of the ship his den, and you're in his territory. Do you have any dry flares left?" He said, "I have the last one in my hand right now, and it seems to be keeping him from attacking. But he's moving this way, and he's also blocking the doorway out." I said, "Throw anything you have at his eyes." Nick put the flare on the edge of the wet bed between him and the giant gator, so he could use both hands to grab stuff to throw at the gator's head. The huge gator was moving forward to Nick, who was back up on the bed as far as he could go. Nick was grabbing books and anything he could get his hands on to use as weapons. Nick went over to one of the bedposts and broke off one of the decorative wooden carved pineapples and threw it at the gator's head. The gator didn't like it, but it was not going to stop him from coming. The top of one of the carved pineapples was sharp, and when it hit the gator's head, it made the gator stop his attack for a moment, and he moved back a bit. There were books on the shelf next to the bed that had not fallen out when the ship rolled over, and Nick started grabbing for them and throwing them at the gator's eyes too. It just wasn't working. The gator would close and protect his eyes every time one of these books bounced off his thick armored skin. Nick reached up and found a book bigger than the rest of the books on the shelf and pulled it down. When he did, a 300-year-old flintlock pistol with a gold coin embedded on one side of the handle and a silver coin embedded on the other side fell out on the bed next to him. Nick had accidentally found the pistol. He got on the radio to me and excitedly said, "Jillian, I found it. I have the pistol." I came back on the radio and said, "That's great. Can you get out of there now?" Nick said, "I can't get past this guy. He's blocking the doorway. He's not attacking right now because of all the stuff I'm throwing at him and the flare is still burning. But he won't move and the mud is getting higher. One more thing. I think the walls of the ship are starting to crush under the weight of all this mud. I'll keep trying to get him to move from the door, but I don't know if I can get out of here." Chapter 13. Giles arrives. Just as if nothing else could go wrong, a boat pulled up on the bank in the middle of this hurricane on the riverside. 3 men got up on the overflowing bank in their boat and were looking down at the rising swamp. It was Giles and 2 of his thugs. They were looking at me in the Beetle Light jigger with the zip line attached to the tree limb on the island. Giles could see the island was sinking as the mud got higher, and that I was clearly on the radio with someone that was down inside the sinking ship. Since Nick cleared away all the brush, he could see the ship doorway and the mud coming in too. He also saw all the alligators. Giles and his thugs looked like bears I had seen on our fishing trips in Montana. The bears just wait for the wolves to do all the work and bring down the elk or deer for dinner, and then the bears come in and take the prize away. He was letting us take all the chances. Then I think he would try to steal what we found with his 2 thugs. I radioed to Nick. "We have company. Giles is here with a boat and 2 of his thugs watching. I think he's going to try to take the pistol from us." Nick came back on the radio and said, "There may be nothing to take. I can't get past this gator. He won't let me pass the doorway." Nick's flare was almost burned up, and he had to do something, so he emptied the shelves of every book, throwing everything left at the gator's head. Nick then went over to one of the other bedposts to break off another decorative pineapple, and it easily came off in his hand. This pineapple wasn't solid wood like the others. It was hollow, and the top of it opened. Nick opened the top of it to reveal what looked like small shining pieces of clear glass. He dumped some of them out on the bed. It was hard to see in the red flare light, but they were diamonds, hundreds of big diamonds that the pirate Stede Bonnet had hidden in the pineapple bedpost. Nick opened the secret compartment on his other artificial leg to store the pineapple. When he opened the compartment of his leg, he saw a high-pressure spray can. He had forgotten that he still had this can of pepper spray from an earlier mission that he had never taken out. He stuffed the diamond-filled pineapple in the compartment and got on the radio to me and said, "Jillian, I have pepper spray from another mission that I had forgotten about." I said, "Nick, that's your ticket out. Shoot the gator in the eyes and don't miss, then in the mouth, and get ready to run out the doorway because he's going to freak out big time after you hit him with that stuff. It's potent and will burn his eyes temporarily." Nick got his stuff together and put the pistol in his belt and the radio in his leg compartment. Nick stopped throwing things at the gator and moved the flare back from his face to bring him in closer. The gator started moving in closer to the bed toward Nick. Nick let him get as close as was safe. The room was half filled with water, mud, and books. Nick leaned forward as the gator slowly came close, and Nick took aim and shot 2 powerful streams of very potent pepper spray into both eyes of the gator. The gator let out a loud roar and shook his head violently, but still had his mouth open, so Nick emptied the bottle of pepper spray in his mouth and all over the head of the gator. The gator came into the cabin around the bed, thrashing, rolling, and breaking furniture, shelves, and one leg of the bed that Nick was up on. This dumped Nick into the muddy water filling the cabin. Just like Jillian said, the gator was freaking out as the painful chemicals in the pepper concoction took effect. The gator was blinded temporarily. The doorway was free, and the gator couldn't see. His eyes were burning with pain. This would only last for a little while, because the water the gator was in would wash away the sting of the pepper spray soon. It would give Nick a chance to get up and out of the ship, however. Nick was climbing up the stairs as the mud was pouring down in his face. His high-tech feet were slipping on the muddy wooden stairs, but he kept pushing up through the mud waterfall coming down the stairs. The giant gator was so powerful and thrashing so much that he knocked over one of the cannons on the cannon deck as Nick climbed up and out of the sinking ship. Nick finally came out the top of the doorway, but the island was gone and under water. The hurricane swelled the river so high it spilled over and completely flooded the pond. Nick was standing in 2 feet of muddy water on top of the island, and the ship was being crushed and sinking down as if it was in quicksand beneath his feet. The Royal James would be lost under tons of mud and all its contents and rotten structure. It would be crushed into 1,000,000 pieces and buried forever in the swamp. Nick opened his leg that had the radio in it and grabbed a pair of wire cutters to cut the zip line that was around the sinking tree limb. He grabbed the line that was attached to the jigger I was sitting in. He got on his radio and pushed the transmit button and yelled at me, "Jillian, you're going to have to put the jigger in reverse and pull me across the pond to you up on the bank, and fast. Do it quick. The other gators are coming after me now that I'm in the water." I yelled back, "Roger that." I threw the jigger into reverse and pulled Nick back across the pond as fast as the jigger could go. As the Royal James Island imploded and sank below Nick's artificial feet, I could see he was out in the middle of a pond with no island, and all the gators were coming directly after him. I was dragging him as he held tightly onto the zip line. He was like fish bait on the end of a hook as I pulled him across the muddy water. Then I saw something big come up out of the muddy water where the ship had just gone down. It was the man-eater. The pepper spray had worn off, and he was mad and coming straight for Nick. I was going as fast as I could in reverse, but I was going up and over logs and in gullies, and it was not moving as fast as this man-eater was coming after Nick. He was gaining on Nick, and there was nothing I could do about it. I just kept driving. Nick looked back and saw the giant gator was getting closer and chasing him across this pond, and we still had 100 feet to go. Nick wasn't going to make it. I didn't know what to do. Nick couldn't do anything either. It was just a matter of time until the man-eater got to him. The jigger was going as fast as it could over this rough terrain. We were 50 feet from shore, and the man-eater started opening his mouth to kill Nick. As I was driving as fast as I could, I looked up on the riverbank through the rain and the wind, and there was Giles and his 2 thugs just watching. They didn't even try to help or do anything. I couldn't believe it. These guys were the worst people I had ever known in my life. I kept driving, and we were 25 feet from shore. The giant gator finally got to Nick, clamping his huge jaws down on one of Nick's legs and ripping it off. When he clamped down on the high-tech steel and aluminum leg, I saw some of the gator's teeth shatter and blood started coming from his mouth. I finally got Nick to shore. The gator was trying to get the bent metal leg out of his bleeding and cut-up mouth. Nick was wet but unhurt and being funny now that he was safely back on shore. I heard him taunt the gator and say, "I guess you're getting too much iron in your diet. Ha!" I dropped the zip line and drove back down to the shore where Nick was and picked him up. He only had one artificial leg now, so it was a little harder for him to get around until we could get back to Beetletown and get a new leg. As I drove up to Nick, he pulled out a 300-year-old pirate flintlock pistol from his belt and handed it to me. He said, "Let's not do that again." I gave him a big hug and said, "Sorry, I had no idea it was going to be that dangerous, and I'm sorry about your leg." Nick said, "Don't worry about it. The guys back at the lab are working on a new model that I wanted to try out anyway." We both laughed for a second, and then we looked down at the flintlock pistol. Nick said, "Isn't this cool? Do you know how old this thing is? The Smithsonian Museum is going to love this." The fun ended when we looked up and saw Giles was watching the whole thing, and saw that we had the pistol. He started his boat across the pond, which was mostly lake by now, and tried to get us and take the pistol before we could get away into the swampy forest. We quickly got the jigger going and turned it around, heading deep into the forest swamp, to the road 3 miles away where Major Santos would meet us with the van. Giles and his men had a powerboat, which was faster on water than a jigger, but a jigger could drive on land or water. Finally something went our way, and we were on solid, muddy ground, but it was ground, and they would not be able to follow us in their boat. Giles was out of luck, and we had the pistol. Unfortunately, Giles was not finished with us, and we would have to deal with him again soon. Nick also had a surprise for us that we would all find out about later. Hurricane Gloria was getting bad, and we wanted to get out of there and safely back to Beetletown. So we radioed Major Santos that the mission was accomplished and to bring the van to get us. As Nick and I were racing through the swamp in the Jigger, Giles turned around his boat and headed back down the Cape Fear River to the main dock, where his car was. He knew where we were headed. There was only one main road on the other side of the swamp in the direction we were headed. Major Santos already had one of the Beetle Light vans waiting for us on the main road behind the swamp. The Jigger could drive right up into the back of it when we got there. The van would carry the Jigger and us back home to the security of Beetletown. Giles had driven his boat back to the dock and got into his car. He drove around the swamp to the road where Major Santos was waiting in the van. Giles drove his car back into the bushes and just waited and watched. We finally made our way through the swamp and onto the road where Major Santos was waiting. We drove up into the back of the van, closed the door, and took off down the road to Beetletown. Unfortunately, Giles was behind us, following from a safe distance, so we didn't see him. It was a long drive back to our town of Lightning Bow and to Beetletown. Giles pulled over to the side of the road and saw us go up to the security gate, show our passes to the guard, and the security gate opened. We drove in and out of Giles' sight. He just sat there thinking and scheming as to how he was going to get the pistol. Chapter 14, showing Major Santos what we found. We all met back at Major Santos's office, over on the aircraft side of Beetletown. I pulled out the pistol and laid it on Major Santos's desk. After all the racing back to Beetletown, this was the first time we had been able to see it clearly. He was very impressed with it and said, "This sure has seen a lot of history. I can't believe it's 300 years old." Nick said, "It's been well preserved in the library. There were a lot of books and other things that I would like to have saved before the ship imploded and sunk into that mud pit. Everything down there is lost and ruined forever now. But we do have this pistol." Both Major Santos and I looked at Nick, and he had a funny look on his face, like he knew something we didn't. Major Santos asked him pointedly, "Nick, did something else happen on that ship you're not telling us about?" Nick was in a wheelchair because he had only had one leg, after the man-eater had eaten the other leg in the escape across the muddy swamp. He rolled over close to Major Santos's desk and popped open the secret compartment on the only leg he had left and said, "Well, when I was down in the cabin and the man-eater was coming at me, I was throwing anything and everything I could at his head and his eyes, like Jillian suggested. I couldn't wait any longer because Nick was stretching the story out forever, so I blurted out, 'What else did you find down there in the cabin?' Nick reached into his leg compartment and pulled out a carved wooden pineapple bedpost knob and put it on the desk in front of us. Major Santos and I looked at each other wondering what the big deal was. And we kind of humored Nick by saying, 'Okay, it's a nice old carved pineapple, but it's a pineapple.' Nick looked at us and smiled and said, 'You guys don't get it. It opens.' He leaned over to the desk and gave the top part of the pineapple a twist, and it opened. Now he had our attention. Major Santos asked, 'Is there anything in it?' Nick said understatedly, just a couple of things," as he poured out hundreds of completely clear, large, 300-year-old diamonds from inside the pineapple on top of Major Santos's desk. There was complete silence in the room, as we all took our first good look at these glimmering jewels that were worth a fortune. Nick looked up at us and said, "So what do you think about that?" Major Santos said, "I don't know quite what to think about that." I just said, "The gentleman pirate was hiding more than just a pistol in his cabin. What shall we do with all of this?" Major Santos said, "Jillian, this rightly belongs to you. You're going to have to figure out what you want to do with all of them." Nick nodded in agreement and collected the jewels and put them back in the pineapple. Major Santos picked up the pineapple and took it over to his safe, where he kept his secret government documents. He put the pineapple inside the safe, closed, and locked the door. He turned to me and said, "Jillian, when you've decided what you want to do with these, let me know, and I will get these out for you. Until then, they will be the safest in here." Just then an agent came to Major Santos's office and said, "There's some guy at the front security gate requesting to be given some kind of antique pistol. He has an old map that he said was given to him that is proof the pistol belongs to him. I don't understand what he's saying. He looks like kind of a seedy character. I wouldn't trust him." Major Santos said, "Thank you. Tell him I'll be right down to see him." Major Santos looked a little panicked and said, "This is what Washington was afraid of. Something like this could expose our total mission here and the undercover operations you kids are doing for the country. I have to call Washington now and get them up to speed. At least this guy doesn't know about the diamonds." I looked at him and said, "My grandfather wanted millions of people to see this pistol as American history, and for no one to make money from it. That man down there is Giles, and he must have followed us back here. He stole that map from my grandfather's bedstand when I was out of the room looking for a nurse in the hospital." Major Santos looked at me sympathetically and said, "I know, Jillian, but we cannot expose what we are really doing here at Beetletown. If Giles turns this into a legal thing, people may find out that this is not really a dome to protect fireflies in the forest. It's a base for disabled secret agents involved in undercover missions for our country. We can't take the chance that it becomes public. Let me go down and see what this guy wants." Major Santos then left the room and went outside to the security gate to meet Giles. Major Santos went out to the front gate, where the guard had Giles waiting. Major Santos rolled over to Giles and asked, "Can I help you?" Giles said, "You have a girl in there that has something that is rightly mine. It is an antique pistol she found in an old ship that was in a swamp." Then Giles started spinning the biggest lie ever. "The grandfather of the girl, I think her name is Jillian, who was inside these gates, gave me this map, and when he was dying in the hospital told me that if I followed the map that I would find an old pirate ship. Inside the ship would be an old flintlock pistol from a famous pirate, Stede Bonnet, which everyone in our town of Charleston knows. The pistol is quite valuable, and the old man gave it to me as his last dying wish. Here is the proof." Giles pulled out a map he had stolen from the bedstand when my grandfather had put it down to get more oxygen. Major Santos knew he was lying, but played along. Major Santos wanted to know how much Giles knew about Jillian, and if he knew what went on here at the Beetle Light complex. So he asked, "So how do you know the pistol is here?" Giles said, "I followed Jillian and another kid that lost his artificial leg from a huge alligator in the pond, where the ship was." Major Santos played it up and asked, "Was there a ship in a swamp? That sounds a little strange." Giles was getting annoyed and said, "Yes, there was. Because of the hurricane, it was swamped and swallowed up in a mud pit. But I do have this map as proof of the old man's intentions that I was to have the pistol." Then Giles looked at Major Santos and asked, what he was hoping Giles would not ask, "What is this place, and why is there so much security here?" Major Santos quickly replied, "We are studying and preserving a very important endangered species of firefly here." Giles went on to ask, "So why was the girl driving that strange vehicle with the 6 wheels, and who was that boy in the swamp?" Major Santos had to act like Nick and I were doing something we weren't supposed to be doing in order to keep up the deception with Giles. So Major Santos said, "Well, those 2 were supposed to be out in the swamp gathering samples, but then the hurricane hit and we had to come pick them up. Let me make a call and see what's going on here. Would you excuse me?" Giles said certainly, because it looked like Major Santos was starting to believe his lie. Major Santos went into the security shack by the front gate while Giles was waiting out in the rainstorm, which was not quite over yet. Major Santos called his commander in Washington and explained everything, including the fact that Giles had stolen something belonging to the Catawba Tribe's new leader, who was one of the agents of the Beetle Light team. The commander told Major Santos he understood, but under no circumstances could it get out what was really going on here at Beetletown. He told Major Santos that the pistol would have to be given to this thief to get rid of him, unless Major Santos could come up with another solution which would not give away the fact that Nick and Jillian were undercover agents for Beetle Light. Major Santos said, "I understand, sir, and will take care of it." With that, he hung up the phone and started figuring out what he was going to do with Giles, before Giles started asking any more questions about what the Beetle Light complex was all about. He needed to buy time to make a plan. Major Santos came out to Giles and said, "It is clear the girl you're talking about does have the antique pistol. She believes it's hers, but after seeing that you have the map as proof, I tend to believe it belongs to you. So here's what we will do. Leave me your phone number, and I will see to it that Jillian calls you, and I will have her make arrangements to get the pistol to you. Will that satisfy you?" Giles couldn't believe his good luck and said, "Yes, that will be satisfactory." Giles quickly scribbled down his phone number and gave it to Major Santos. Major Santos took the paper with the phone number on it and added, "Thanks for stopping by, and we'll clear this up. I'll have the girl give you a call as soon as she finishes with some experiments she's doing inside the lab." Giles shook Major Santos's hand, turned with a greedy smile, and got into his car and drove away. Major Santos turned and headed back inside Beetletown and said to himself, "He's not getting that gun. And now I have to go wash the sleaze off my hand." Major Santos pulled out a radio and said to an agent on the radio, "Assemble Jillian, Nick, Doris, the head cook from Dirty Zert's Cafe, and have them meet me at the cafe." Then the agent on the radio said, "Yes, sir," and assembled the team. Chapter 15. The Dirty Zert's Meeting. Major Santos rolled up to the cafe. Nick, me, and the head cook Doris, that ran Dirty Zert's, were all at the Dirty Zert's Cafe waiting as ordered. I was very anxious as to what the orders from Washington were, so I blurted out, "So, what did they say?" Major Santos did not look happy and said, "Washington, as expected, said under no circumstances are you to give away what you are doing here, and you must give Giles the pistol." My heart sunk, and I said, "You have to be kidding. We're going to just hand over the flintlock to that thief?" Major Santos said, "Yes, we're going to give him a flintlock pistol, but not the one he's expecting." "That is why you are here, Doris," Major Santos said. Doris was the head cook at the Dirty Zert's Cafe here at Beetletown, and she could make anything look and taste great. She was hearing impaired, but could read lips perfectly, and in addition to being an incredible artist with desserts, was one of the few adults with disabilities allowed at the Beetle Light complex. This was because she was also an instructor. She taught hand signing as well as the fine art of reading lips for some of our hearing impaired agents. The kids all liked her because she also made the most incredible potted dirt you've ever tasted in the Dirty Zert's Cafe. We were all wondering why Doris was asked to come to the meeting, though. Major Santos pulled out the pirate Steed Bonnet's real flintlock pistol and rolled over to Doris, who was so excited to be asked to come to the meeting. She had only cooked in the dessert cafe and trained some kids occasionally. She never got to do anything exciting. Major Santos handed Doris the flintlock pistol and said, "This is a 300-year-old pistol. Be very careful with it. Can you make a candy replica of this gun? Something that will dissolve in water, but will look identical to this real gun?" Doris looked the gun over and started talking to herself about how to do it and said, "I could make the handle out of light chocolate and the barrel out of dark." She was thinking about how to make the fake gold and silver coins embedded in the handle as well, and continued on to say, "I could flatten jelly beans and melt them into a mold, spray paint them with gold and silver food coloring." She started measuring it with a measuring tape. There was a long silence, and then she looked up at Major Santos and said, "When I'm finished, you won't be able to tell which is real and which you can eat." We were all excited. Major Santos said, "Jillian, you're going to have to call Giles and pretend you're very unhappy with having to give the pistol back, but that you've been ordered to do it by your boss. That's me. You will have to set up a meeting back at the gator pond for this to work. We are taking a chance by doing this, but there's no way I'm going to let that thief take what's rightly your tribe's piece of history. If we are successful, the candy pistol will accidentally end up in the gator-infested water, where it will dissolve, and he'll never find it. This plan meant that we were to accidentally drop the pistol in the water at some point. Major Santos went on to say, "Jillian, the Smithsonian will not be able to display this pistol, or Giles will find out what we have done. You will have to find another way to honor your grandfather's wish that millions of people would get to see this piece of history, and without Giles finding about it or us. I'll let you work on that problem. For now, we need to set up a meeting at the Gator Pond." Major Santos had Doris go and start working on the fake candy pistol, and had the rest of us huddle around to hear his plan. Chapter 16, Day of the Exchange. I called Giles on the phone and said that I had been told to give the gun back by my boss, but that I wanted the map from my grandfather in exchange. Giles said he would bring the map and we could exchange the pistol for the map. The map was worthless to him, but had sentimental value to me. I told him that we would meet back at the Gator Pond. He was to bring his boat up the Cape Fear River like before, and I would come through the swamp, which was now flooded. I would come to the exchange in one of Beetle Light's airboats, which were made for high speed through the swamps. I told Giles I saw the two thugs he brought the last time, and I didn't trust him. So we would meet in the middle of the Gator Pond, in separate boats where the Royal James went down for the exchange. An airboat is what we use to get through the swamps in the south. You sit up high, where you don't have to worry about gators, and a giant propeller pushes you over water, brush, and mud. It's also really fast, and if we had to get away from Giles in a hurry for some reason, he could never catch us in his outboard motorboat. We would meet Giles at 3:00 p.m. Doris was hurrying to get the fake flintlock finished in time. We loaded up the airboat on a trailer and were just waiting for Doris to finish. I found out later that Major Santos, on his own, had contacted some of his Navy SEAL buddies, which I had worked with before on the Cuba mission, and that they were on standby during this exchange with Giles. Major Santos handed me a transmitter with a red button on it and told me, "If you get into any trouble with Giles, all you have to do is push this button, and a Marine helicopter gunship with Navy SEALs will be above you in 3 minutes, giving you more protection than you would ever need against Giles and his men." Major Santos was kind of like my dad now, and was very protective of his agents. It felt good to have him there, if we needed him. Doris walked in with an ice cooler and the pirate pistol. She opened the cooler and reached in and pulled out what looked like the same old pirate flintlock pistol, with the gold coin and silver coins embedded in the handle. You could not tell them apart. She said, "You need to keep the candy pistol in the cooler until you're about to give it to Giles, so it will stay hard, won't melt, and look real. It is made of light and dark chocolate and melted jelly beans for the coins, which were spray-painted gold and silver food coloring. The flint part of the gun was made from rock candy, chipped to look just right. Doris warned us, as soon as it hits the water, it will start to melt in the swamp water, and Giles can look forever and never find it." Then Doris signed with her hands. "That will teach him." We all smiled. Major Santos said, "Excellent job, Doris." I chimed in, "Yeah, thanks for doing this." Doris said, "My pleasure." With that, Nick and I left in the truck with the driver and Major Santos directly for the swamp. The driver drove the truck with the trailer off the main road, down a dirt road into the back country, and next to the clearing and a flooded area. He backed the truck and the trailer, carrying the airboat down into the swamp, and Nick and I got up into the control seats. Since I knew these swamps like the back of my hand, I took the controls. Major Santos was in the truck and grabbed something I left on the seat and said, "Don't forget this." He then threw the emergency transmitter to me, which had a cord around it, so I put it around my neck. Just then a big blast of wind came down over the trees. It was the Marine gunship that Major Santos had arranged for. It landed next to us in the tall grass, and one of the SEALs that I remember working with on our Cuba mission waved at me, so I waved back. He yelled out the door of the helicopter, "Remember, we leave no one on our team behind. Call us if you need us." I nodded and waved back. Nick leaned over to me and said, "You have some pretty powerful friends. I'm impressed." I said, trying to be cool, "Oh, these guys I worked with on a mission down in Cuba." Nick replied, "Must have been a big mission." I have to admit that it was pretty cool to know these guys and know they'd be looking out for us if anything went wrong. We strapped in and turned the throttle on the metal pole, which makes the airboat go forward. It is completely controlled by hand, so not having the use of my legs was no problem for me. When you wanted to go right, you pushed the stick right. When you wanted to go left, you pushed it left. When you wanted to go fast, you twisted the throttle. We wanted to go fast, so I cranked the throttle and we jetted through the swamp, heading to the gator pond for the meeting. Chapter 17. Meeting at the Gator Pond. It was 2:45, and Giles and his 2 men were already there waiting for us. That airboat was so much faster than the jigger that we all got there 15 minutes early. I let off on the throttle, and the airboat came to a stop at the edge of the flooded forest. Giles was on the other side of the pond, where the Cape Fear River overflowed into the pond. There were still alligators everywhere, but no sign of the man-eater, which had eaten Nick's metal leg and foot. He now had a new pair of legs, with a better design. He was happy with these legs. We weren't sure how all this was going to go. Our plan was to meet Giles in the middle of the pond, and during the exchange, pretend to fumble the candy gun and drop it in the water, while trying to throw it to Giles's boat. I twisted the throttle, and the giant propeller started blowing wind behind us that pushed us out into the middle of the gator pond. It stirred up the gators, and they started coming out toward us. Giles started his little outboard boat and started coming to meet us in the middle of the pond. The sides of his boat were high enough that it would be pretty hard for a gator to get up and over the railing, so he and his man felt pretty safe as they approached us in the middle of the pond. Giles was standing up in the front of his boat, and one of his men was in the back controlling the engine. Giles was directing where they should go. As Giles was heading for us, I saw a big ripple coming from under the water in the direction of Giles. It was big, I mean man-eater big. It was coming right for Giles and his boat, and was going underneath it. I don't know, with Giles being such a bad guy, why I did it, but I yelled out a warning to him. "Hey Giles, look out, there's something big under your boat. You better sit down and hold on." He rudely replied back to me, not seeing the danger, "Don't worry about me, just bring me that flintlock." Just as he got the last word out, something big came up from under his boat, crashing into the bottom of it, knocking him out of the boat and into the water. The man controlling the motor in Giles' boat also got knocked halfway out of the boat. He got back in, panicked, and turned the boat around and headed back for the safety of the riverbank and out of the middle of the gator pond, leaving Giles screaming in the middle of the pond. "Someone help!" Giles screamed. We were the only ones left there to help him, but we were not that close to where he was thrashing in the water. The man-eater came to the surface over by where his boat had gone to get away, and then the gator realized someone was in the water panicking, and it slowly headed back to the middle of the pond where Giles was thrashing around in the water screaming for help. Giles was trying to swim to our airboat since we were closer. When he turned around, he saw the man-eater coming straight for him. Giles remembered what the man-eater had done to Nick's artificial leg, and he knew he was dead if he couldn't get to our boat, and we were still 50 feet away. This gave me an idea. I yelled to Giles, "Hey Giles, he's coming for you. Throw something at his head." Giles took off his shoes and threw them back, wildly missing the gator's head, and the giant gator kept coming. Giles was begging for help. "Please help me, I'll do anything." I replied back, "I could throw something at him to slow him down, but—" He yelled back, "Do it! Just do it!" I replied back, "All I have is the flintlock pistol. I could try to aim for his eyes. That might stop him or slow him down." Giles was still swimming and still was so greedy for the pistol that he came back and said, "Don't you have anything else?" I replied back, "No, that's all I have." He paused for a minute as he was still swimming toward us and then said, "All right, do it. I'll have to come back and try to find it later. Just don't miss." I pulled the ice-cold fake flintlock pistol from the ice cooler and took careful aim and threw it right at the gator's head as he was about to bite Giles. The pistol hit the gator in the head above his eye, but it was like a solid chunk of ice hitting you in the head, and even this big man-eater didn't like it, so he backed off for a minute. I twisted the throttle and headed for Giles, and Nick threw him a line. Giles grabbed the line, and we dragged him back over to the other side of the pond at high speed, and the man-eater could not chase us fast enough. We got Giles back to his boat, and his man helped him back in. Giles was mad at this man for leaving him in the middle of the pond, and said to him, "I'll deal with you later." Giles collected himself and had a hard time getting it out, but finally said, "Thank you for saving my life." I said, "No problem, but now we don't have the flintlock." I held up my part of the deal. "I would like my grandfather's map, please." Giles reluctantly fished through a duffel bag, and just as he was pulling out the map, I could see behind him the candy gold coin that was attached to the candy flintlock had floated to the surface. I could see it was melting, but there was still enough of it to see that it was the gold coin that was supposed to be on the handle of the gun, and gold doesn't float. If Giles turned around and saw that floating gold coin, our deception would be found out, and we would still have a problem with Giles. We had to keep his attention looking at us until the fake coin dissolved out of sight. Giles rolled up the map and threw it over to our boat. Nick caught it. After giving the map back to us, Giles turned around to find a place to sit down in his boat. When he was sitting back down, he saw the floating coin out a ways from his boat, which had finally started to lose its color, but now looked like a clear, flat jelly bean in the shape of a coin. This piqued his curiosity. Giles saw it floating and said, "What is that?" He couldn't tell what it was, but my heart was jumping out of my chest. Giles, still not knowing what it was, grabbed an oar in his boat to pull the floating object over to get a closer look. Just as he put his hand on the oar in his boat, a huge gator with his mouth wide open came up from the deep and ate the floating jelly bean coin. The wave caused Giles to get knocked off his seat and to the floor of his boat. He yelled back to his man at the engine, "That's enough. Let's get out of here." Then they took off down the Cape Fear River. It was getting a little uncomfortable with all these gators around, and the man-eater could be a problem even to us in our big airboat, so I twisted the throttle and turned the boat back through the swamp. Nick and I each gave each other a high five. We did it. I got on the radio to Major Santos and said, "Mission accomplished. Giles will not be a problem again. I have the map back. I will give details when we meet back at the trailer. Tell the helicopter and the crew they can go, and thanks for being there." Mission accomplished. All I heard back was Major Santos say, "Roger that. Well done." On the way back through the swamp, I kept thinking, now what am I going to do with that gun and my grandfather's last request? Chapter 18. Jillian hatches Operation Mouse House. It was a week later, and Hurricane Gloria had gone. The East Coast was still cleaning up from it. Because the dome over the Beetle Light complex, the firefly forest, and the fireflies were unhurt. I was in the glowworm cave one day, kayaking through, and looked up at the faint blue lights the glowworms give off as they hang from the ceiling. I leaned back in my kayak, as I like to do, and I just stared at the patterns the lights made as I floated in the dark. It may sound weird, but as I stared at the ceiling of the dark cave, I saw an interesting pattern that gave me an idea of how to honor my grandfather's last request, that many people would be able to see this pirate flintlock pistol that was part of American history. As I looked up at the ceiling, the glowworms happened on that day to make a pattern of 3 circles, one big circle with 2 smaller circles on top of the big circle, and the 2 smaller circles were spread apart equally. This image is from one of the most beloved and famous characters in the world. It was the outline of a very famous mouse head, which represents a very famous theme park in Orlando, Florida. It was probably my favorite place in the world to go when I was a kid, and I still enjoy going there to this day. It is known to most Americans as the happiest place on earth. I started thinking, what if we could get a real pirate flintlock pistol hidden in plain sight amongst all the other pirate pistols, coins, and treasure from the 1700s that are on a certain pirate ride at this theme park. This wouldn't be the Smithsonian Museum, but at least as many people would see it, probably much more. This would satisfy my grandfather's wish, and since we would donate the pistol in a sense, we would not be making any money from it, as my grandfather wished. People would see real history and not even know it. I thought the idea was perfect. Now, who did I know at this theme park? There are many thousands of employees that work there. I got on the phone to the elders of our tribe, and I put the word out to see if anyone from any of our tribes worked at this theme park. After 2 weeks, I got an answer back that someone I had never met from a southern branch of our tribe worked there. I can't say who they were or what their job was at the park back in the 1980s, or I would have given them away. I contacted this person and gave them a little backstory of our tribe's part in this American history story. I also told them that it was my grandfather's dying request, and that it must be done this way, because the pistol would gather too much attention from Giles any other way. This person understood and said they could help with this mission. I went to Major Santos and asked if we could do this, and he didn't even call Washington. He just said, "It's a great idea, and a fitting place to donate this piece of history." We called it Operation Mouse House. I set up a meeting with this employee at the Orlando airport, which is near the theme park. Our helicopter would bring me and the gentleman pirate's Stede Bonnet's flintlock pistol to be given to our friend, and they would see to it that it made its way to the pirate ride. Here it could be seen by millions of people, and my grandfather's wish would have been fulfilled. As we were flying from Lightning Bow down the coast of Florida, I heard the pilot ask the airport tower controller for permission to land at the Orlando International Airport. The air traffic controller said, "You are cleared to land." We had just flown over the theme park, and boy was it big. We touched down, and the person we were waiting for came through the gate and up to the helicopter. This person said, "Welcome to the happiest place on earth. I was sorry to hear of your grandfather's passing, but we will try to honor him with his last request." I was touched at these words, and gave this person the last instructions. "Thank you. The pistol's to be hidden somewhere on the pirate ride amongst all the other pirate stuff, but in plain sight so enough people can see the pistol with the gold and silver coins in the handle. I don't want you to get into trouble, though, so if it's going to get you into trouble, call me, and we'll come back and pick up the flintlock, okay?" Our volunteer said, "Okay, we'll see how it goes." Then this person took the box with the flintlock in it and said, "It will be hidden in plain sight if you're really looking for it. I will call you when it's done." With that, this person turned and headed back to the park. We took off and headed back for Lightning Bow, flying over the huge theme park. I still felt those feelings of loving this place. I wished I could spend the day at the park. But we had to get the helicopter back to Beetletown. The millions of dollars in diamonds from the Royal James were still locked up in Major Santos's safe, and put to use in a story you might read about in the future. For now, I just wanted Operation Mouse House to succeed. A week later, I was at the Dirty Zerts Cafe, and Doris said I had a call. Doris handed me the phone, and my special contact down in Orlando just said 3 words and hung up the phone. The words were, "It is done." I don't know even to this day if our volunteer agent got permission from the park or just donated it to the ride secretly. But if you go on this pirate ride and look carefully at all the treasure and old pirate flintlocks throughout the ride, you might see a real pirate flintlock pistol with a gold and silver coin embedded in the handle. It is safe to say that millions of people have already seen the pistol by now, and my grandfather would have been pleased. It's a big ride and could be hidden anywhere. Going on the ride many times myself, I have finally found where it was placed. But I wouldn't spoil the surprise for anyone looking for it. The fun is in finding the gentleman pirate's pistol for yourself. Chapter 19. Nothing but a Louisiana license plate. We've gotten word from some of our tribe members near the Cape Fear River that an old antique dealer in a very big boat has sometimes been seen at the Gator Pond with a grappling hook. He throws the grappling hook out into the middle of the water, trying to snag something he must have lost from the bottom of the Gator Pond. He seems to always go home empty-handed, however. Over all the many years he's been back looking for whatever it was he lost in the pond, all he's ever found are 3 boots, 2 fishing poles, and a rusted license plate from the state of Louisiana. If you could see my face right now, I'm smiling. Watch for Beetle Light Journal number 5.